And if I told you that Ferrari, after weeks of frustration and a hesitant start, has finally begun to understand the puzzle represented by the SF25? The 2025 season for Ferrari started in the midst of an undeniable euphoria. Lewis Hamilton's signing was not only a sporting play, but a statement of intent. Ferrari wanted to be the protagonist again, not only in headlines but in time leaves. However, from the first meters on track, it was clear that promise and reality were not going to be so easily. The SF25, with all the expectation of its redesigned design and the renewal of technical philosophy, turned out to be an aerodynamic puzzle that no one inside Maranello knew how to solve at all. In Australia, Ferrari showed erratic performance. In classification, both pilots were far from the fight for pole, and in the race, the degradation of tires and the rear train instability were evident. Hamilton, in particular, lived a much more complicated debut than expected. Accustomed to Mercedes's mechanical language, he discovered that SF25 required a complete adaptation of his driving style. He tried to replicate the Leclerc technique to release the brake later, to maintain more minimal curve, and although there were progress, what he found was a general lack of confidence in the rear axle of the car. The rear did not respond with the predictability that a pilot needs to push to the limit. Leclerc was not comfortable either. Despite knowing the dynamics of the team, he was disconnected from the balance of the SF25. The car seemed to have an extremely narrow operating window, which meant that any small mismatch in tire temperature, aerodynamic pressure, or asphalt height translated into a remarkable loss of performance. The sensations collected in Australia were confirmed in China, where the slightly colder conditions and the area of the circuit further complicated the task. Leclerc suffered a touch with Hamilton in the first curve, which damaged the front wing, and decided to continue without changing it. This gave more peak speed but less curve. It was a race that perfectly summed up Ferrari's frustration. Decisions committed to an unbalanced car. The technical drama intensified in Japan, where the limitations of the SF25 were amplified by the new technical directive of rigid spoilers. Ferrari not only lost time in classification against McLaren and Mercedes, but in the race he showed to be unable to maintain the rhythm of the leaders. The rear degradation was again the protagonist, and pit strategies did not help. The team was caught, without a solid aerodynamic base, without constant performance, and with two pilots adapting in opposite ways to a car that still did not show its true face. What was lived in those first three races was not simply a bad start. It was the finding of a deeper structural problem in SF25. Despite a completely new architecture compared to the SF24 in the most advanced and designed theory to be an aerodynamically aggressive, the car did not offer reliable feedback to the pilots. The inconsistent behavior did not allow the technical package to be exploited, so even the simulator data ceased to be valid on the track. That disconnection between theory and practice is the greatest enemy that can have a team like Ferrari, not knowing if the problem is in the concept of the car, in its configuration, or in its operational execution. With all this context, the arrival in Imola represented more than a simple race weekend. It was a vital opportunity to begin to understand why SF25 did not work as it should. The technical team led by Leclerc had the pressure to find answers, not only for immediate performance, but to define the future development management. And although the great improvements were postponed for Barcelona, which began to happen in the Italian layout, would change the course of its season. From the outside, the expectation was clear. Many expected Ferrari to introduce the so-promised improvement package of the SF25. A deep update expected from the problems identified in Australia, which theoretically had to transform the car's behavior. But when the team arrived in Emilia Romagna, they revealed a decision that generated confusion in the Tifosi. The updates had been postponed. It was not a whim or a resignation. It was a calculated tactical maneuver. The team, headed by Leclerc, decided that they were not yet ready. There was a technical background reason. The regulation conditions were about to change with the entry into force of a new FIA directive that prohibited certain levels of flexibility in the ailerons. In such a context, introducing a large aerodynamic package without having completely understood how the car was going to react could have been an irreversible error. So instead of rushing, Ferrari chose to step back to reconfigure all its development strategy. The objective, to have a car that not only worked better, but also aligned with future regulations. This script change implied that the SF25 was presented in Imola with just some minor modifications. Fine suspension adjustments, subtle variations in aerodynamic load, and certain configuration changes that, although invisible to the naked eye, were key to start mapping the real behavior of the car. Throughout the weekend, the approach was clear: to collect data. data on the behavior of the rear train, which was still the car heel of the car, data on how SF25 reacted to fuel variations at different levels of downforce, at different temperature ranges and tires. In summary, data that could not be obtained either in the simulator or in the CFDs. The Isola free session was transformed into a rolling test bench. What for other teams was a process prior to the classification, for Ferrari it was a fundamental essay. The engineers worked in parallel on the track and in the factory, comparing telemetrias in real time. What they discovered was as worrying as revealing. The way in which the SF25 managed the dynamic weight between medium and fast curves was unbalanced. This meant that even small balance errors in the configuration could be dramatically amplified during a launched return or a long batch, especially when the conditions of the track fluctuated. Hamilton, since his new perspective within the Scuderia, had a key role in this process. His experience allowed to identify behavior patterns that perhaps Leclerc had already normalized by habit. And although the final result of the weekend in Isola was not spectacular in terms of classification or points, the progress was conceptual. The car had finally begun to speak the same language as its engineers. It was not yet competitive, but it was more understandable. What was previously a total unknown now had at least one clear starting point. In parallel, Ferrari also began modeling the evolution package that would be introduced in Barcelona. With the information collected in Imola, they could define more precisely what elements of the car they required immediate redesign and which ones could expect. Especially, they focused on the efficiency of the diffuser, the interaction between the flat background and the rear wing, and how the rear suspension could adapt to the new regulatory demands. All this with an eye not only to compete in Europe, but to stay relevant during the hottest part of the championship, where sustained performance makes the difference. In short, Imola was not a technical disappointment, it was a surgical operation. Ferrari knew that he could not win the championship on that weekend, but also understood that he could lose it if he took the wrong way. So he chose to learn. He opted for intelligence about anxiety, for the clarity of diagnosis about emotional pressure. And that technical maturity, for the first time in years, showed a Ferrari that is trying not only to run faster but strategically evolve. Imola did not represent a revolution in terms of results, but it did mark a before and after in Ferrari's technical approach. What the team collected there was not simply useful information, but the beginning of a real understanding of SF25. Up to that point, the car had been a black box, a set of aerodynamic promises that failed to materialize on the track. But after the meticulous work sessions in the Enzo E. Dino Ferrari Autodrome, for the first time, the car's behavior began to show predictable patterns. That, for a technical team, is pure gold. A car that responds consistently to changes allows you to make decisions with confidence. And that trust is essential to build sustainable performance. Lewis Hamilton was one of the great drivers of this new understanding. From his role as an experienced pilot, he pressed for a more fluid communication between the track and simulation departments. During the weekend, his methodical approach helped engineers to identify more clearly how certain adjustments affected the dynamics of the car in real conditions. While his times were not yet placed in the direct struggle for pole, his career rhythm was significantly more consistent, which represented a step forward with respect to the two previous races. Hamilton made it clear that he still did not feel completely comfortable, but also acknowledged that there was a tangible improvement in the manageability of the car. On the other hand, Charles Leclerc showed a different interpretation of the same car. While Hamilton opted for a more conservative configuration, Leclerc decided to experiment with a more aggressive tuning. The objective was to force the limits of the SF25 to see how far its performance could be stretched without braking. This contrast between both styles offered Ferrari an extremely valuable double perspective. For the first time, they could compare how the car responded to two different piloting and tuning philosophies, which exponentially enriched its technical database. The main conclusion was that the car was not as unpredictable as it seemed. It simply required a more specific and personalized work range for each pilot. In parallel, the engineering team led by Loic Serra began to define the development parameters that would guide the large update package plan for Barcelona. This will not be a simple change of pieces, but a deep reconfiguration of the aerodynamic concept of the car. It will work particularly in the interaction between the lower flow of the flat background and the diffuser, looking for greater efficiency without sacrificing curve stability. A new rear spoiler configuration is also being designed, adapted to the most rigid Euler directive, which will affect all teams but could benefit those who have done their task in advance. What Ferrari seeks now is not just a specific improvement for a specific career. The objective is to recover the ability to be constant. have a car that does not depend on a favorable circuit or ideal weather conditions. Imola has been the first step towards that goal, a validation that the chosen road but slower and more analytical is correct. The true evaluation will arrive in Barcelona, where it will be seen if the theory and practice finally can be aligned to release all the hidden potential of the SF25. If they succeed, Ferrari will not only return to the fight for podiums, but could reintegrate into the fight for the championship. But for this, they must continue working with the precision of a surgeon, without falling into the temptation to accelerate processes that still require maturation. What Ferrari has started in Imola is not simply a phase of settings, it is a strategic reconfiguration of its entire season. After a start marked by technical frustration, the team has chosen to understand its car in depth instead of hurrying to introduce solutions that could be ineffective. This attitude, more mature and analytical, can be the key that transforms to the SF25 of a promise breach to a competitive machine capable of challenging McLaren, Mercedes and Red Bull in equal terms. The question now is whether this new approach will pay fruits on time. Formula One does not expect anyone, and every lost point can be decisive. However, the first technical indications of this Imola turn are encouraging. For the first time, Ferrari has managed to establish a clear development line based on specific data, and not on idealized assumptions or projections. If this trend is maintained, the next races could offer us a much more prepared, more stable and, above all, more dangerous Scuderia for their direct rivals. And this is where I want to invite you to reflect. Do you think Ferrari has really found the key to unlocking the potential of the SF25? Or are you convinced that Imola is just another technical mirage that will soon be overcome by reality? Does Hamilton have the necessary margin to become the technical leader that Ferrari needs? Or the challenge will be too large for a 7-time world champion? Share your opinion in the comments and submit with us in the deepest analysis of each race. If you are interested in following the complete technical process of evolution of SF25, do not forget to subscribe to the channel.